last topic, we said that we wanted to help our physical and spiritual children learn to explain why choosing to walk by faith will help them and others to avoid the consequences of sin. In this topic, we will see that God is a God of mercy and allowed Abram to rescue Lot so he would have another opportunity to choose to walk by faith. Genesis 14 verse 13 through 16 says, "Then one who had escaped came and told Abram the Hebrew, for he dwelt by the terebinth of Mamre the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and brother of Aner, and they were allies with Abram. Now, when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his 318 trained servants who were born in his own house, and went on pursuit as far as Dan. He divided his forces against them by night, and he and his servants attacked them and pursued them as far as Hobah, which is north of Damascus. So he brought back all the goods, and also brought back his brother and his goods, as well as the women and the people. Lot and the people of Sodom had been taken captive by the kings of the east. However, we see that one person escaped and told Abram that Lot had been captured by the armies of the east. We see that Abram is called Abram, the Hebrew. This is the first time anyone is called a Hebrew in the Old Testament. However, we will see that in the future, the descendants of Abram called themselves Hebrews, and also the people of other nations called them Hebrews. The next recorded time this name is used is when the wife of Potiphar said in Genesis 39 verse 14, "She called to the men of her house and spoke to them, saying, 'See, he has brought into us a Hebrew to mock us. He came in to lie with me, and he cried out with a loud voice.' At that time, Abram was living by a large grove of terebinth trees owned by Mamre. This was in the area of the city of Hebron. Mamre, Eshcol, and Aner were brothers, and they were friends and allies of Abram, so they also joined him to help rescue Lot. Abram had 318 trained servants who had been born in his own house. Mamre, the men related to him, and his brothers also joined with Abram to help him rescue Lot. Abram had trained his servants because they had to help Abram to protect his possessions and flocks from groups like the armies of men that had come from the east. Abram and those with him had to travel more than 150 miles before they caught up with the armies of the east. Abram was a wise fighter, so he divided his troops into smaller groups. Then they attacked during the middle of the night. Gideon used a similar tactic to destroy the Midianites several hundred years later in the book of Judges. Then he chased down those who remained as far as the city of Hobah, which is north of Damascus. They were able to rescue all the hostages who had been captured by the armies of the east. Abram and his army were able to rescue both people and their goods when they defeated these armies from the east. Then Abram and his armies brought back all the people and goods that had been taken from Sodom and Gomorrah. Genesis 14 verse 17 through 20 says, "And the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Shaveh." This is the king's valley after his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out wine and bread. He was a priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." And he gave him a tithe of all. The king of Sodom was quick to go out and meet Abram when he came back after he rescued Lot and the rest of the people in the city of Sodom. This is the only place where the valley of Shaveh, the king's valley, is mentioned. However, many think that this valley is the Kidron Valley, just east of present-day city Jerusalem. This valley is a small valley that goes between Jerusalem and the Mount of Olives. The Lord gave Abram a very special blessing. Melchizedek, the king of Salem, now Jerusalem, is also mentioned in these verses. Since the valley was only a few hundred feet from the city of Salem, we see that Melchizedek brought out bread and wine for Abram and the king of Sodom. In addition to being the king of Salem, these verses tell us that Melchizedek was also a priest of God Most High. Psalm 110 verse 1 and 4 says, "The Lord said to my Lord, Sit at my right hand, till I make your enemies your footstool. The Lord has sworn, and you will not relent. You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. Psalm 110 verse 4 is quoted twice in Hebrews 7 verse 17 and verse 21. Before these two quotes, Hebrews 7 verse 14 through 16 says, "For it is evident that our Lord arose from Judah, of which tribe Moses spoke nothing concerning priesthood. And it is yet far more evident if in the likeness of Melchizedek there arises another priest who has come, not according to the law of a fleshy commandment, but of according to the power of an endless life." As a result, we see that Melchizedek is an Old Testament picture of Christ, and some even think it was an Old Testament appearance of Christ. We see that Melchizedek also gave a blessing to Abram. Melchizedek said, "Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." Here we see that in the blessing, Melchizedek pointed out the fact that this blessing of Abram was in the name of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. The fact that Melchizedek pointed out the fact that the true and living God is a possessor of heaven and earth, and one from whom this blessing for, Abram made it clear that Melchizedek is not talking of any of the false gods of the Canaanites. Melchizedek also gave a blessing to God Most High, because of the fact that he had delivered the enemies into the hand of Abram. The armies of the king of the east were large armies. However, the size of the armies did not matter to God. Even though Abram only had 318 trained servants, plus Mamre, Eshcol, Aner, and probably a few servants with them, God had given Abram a complete victory over the kings of the east and all their armies. Many years later, Jonathan, the son of Saul, said in 1 Samuel 14 verse 6, "Come, let us go over to the garrison of the uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us. For nothing restrains the Lord, saving by many or by few." The Lord did not need a great army to conquer the great army. As Jonathan said, "The God Most High can use many or few. He is not limited the way we are as people." Then Abram gave Melchizedek a tithe of all. This tithe was to show that Abram worshipped the true and living God, of whom Melchizedek was a priest, and who was much greater than Abram was. Genesis 14 verse 21 through 24 says, "Now the king of Sodom said to Abram, 'Give me the persons, and take the goods for yourself.' But Abram said to the king of Sodom, 'I have raised my hand to the Lord, God Most High, the possessor of heaven and earth, that I will take nothing from a thread to a sandal strap, and that I will not take anything that is yours, lest you should say, I have made Abram rich, except only what the young men have eaten, and the portion of the men who went with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre. Let them take their portion.' The king of Sodom had made an offer to Abram. He said, 'Give me the people, and take the goods for yourself.' Here we see that the king of Sodom was offering all the possessions of the city of Sodom to Abram as a gift if he would give the people of Sodom back to the king. This sounds like a very generous offer, but it was really an attempt by Satan to deceive Abram. We see in a few chapters just how evil the king and the people of Sodom were. Abram had made a promise to God before he ever went after the kings of the east and their armies that he would take nothing from the king of Sodom when they returned. He had promised God that he would not even take a string or the strap of a sandal from the king of Sodom, because he knew the king of Sodom would say that he had made Abram rich. Abram realized that everything he had was given to him by the Lord. He wanted to give glory to God by this decision. 1 Corinthians 10 verse 31 says, "Therefore, whether you eat or drink, whether you do all to the glory of God." That is why he said the only thing they would take was the food his servants had eaten as they traveled back to the place after they defeated the kings of the east. The food they had eaten in those few days was gone, and Abram wanted nothing more. At the same time, Abram also recognized that Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre had to make their own decision about whether they wanted to take anything from the king of Sodom. As a result, Abram told the king of Sodom that it was between the king and those men whether they wanted to take a portion of the things that they had captured when they defeated the kings of the east. We see that the king of Sodom had to talk to those men separately, as it was their decision to make. In 1 Thessalonians 5 verse 22, we read, "Abstain from every form of evil." Abram may have known that those men needed some of the things that they had captured because of the fact that they had to leave their own work for a period of time to go along with Abram. As a result, Abram wanted to leave the decision to them. Abram was learning to walk with God by faith. He was learning to look to God for the blessing of the God Most High. Hebrews 11 verse 9 through 10 says, "By faith he dwelt in the land of promise, as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God." Abram was developing an eternal view and not just a focus on the way of this world. In the same way, we want to help our physical and spiritual children learn to walk by faith. This will only happen as we provide an example of faith by our own lives. As a result, Abram gave us two important examples by his life about what it means to put God first and not be deceived by the traps that Satan uses to trick us. May the Lord richly bless you as you show your children how to walk by faith.